The phrase he used was "be patient." 2 words, delivered the way someone offers a glass of water to a person who didn't ask for one. He leaned back in his chair when he said it, and the leather made that small, exhausted sound it makes when an executive shifts his weight without standing up. The clock on his credenza read 4:52 p.m. I remember that because I had been watching it for the last 10 minutes, waiting for him to circle back to the only number that mattered in the conversation. He never did. "Be patient, Marcus. These things have a rhythm. We don't want to set a precedent that disrupts the structure we've built around compensation review." The structure. He said the word like it was something we had agreed on together, like I had been in the room when it was designed. I hadn't been. No one I knew had been. The structure was a closed system that explained, every 12 months, why the answer was the same answer it had been the year before. And the year before that. And the 4 years before that one. My name is Marcus Devlin. I'm 48 years old. At that moment, I was the head of portfolio strategy for a $35 million book of business, sitting across from the CEO of a privately held financial advisory firm in a corner office that overlooked the entire downtown grid. I had been at the company for 19 years. I had been asking for a raise that aligned with my responsibilities for 6 of them. 6 review cycles. 6 versions of the same sentence delivered with slight variations in tone, depending on which quarter we were in and how the markets had treated us. The first year he had said the timing wasn't right. The second year he had said we needed to wait until the next funding round closed. The third year he had used the phrase compression in the middle bands, which meant nothing to anyone outside that room and was, I later realized, not meant to mean anything. The fourth year he had said the board had concerns about salary growth across the leadership tier, and I had nodded because I had been trained over the previous 3 years to accept that the board's concerns were the kind of concerns that did not have rebuttals attached to them. The fifth year, he had said that my portfolio's performance, while strong, was operating in a category that didn't have the kind of comparable benchmarks that would justify the adjustment I was requesting. And now, the 6th year, sitting in that same chair, looking at that same credenza, listening to the same leather sound, I was being told to be patient. I want to tell you what patient had looked like over those 6 years. Patient had looked like 412 client check-ins I had personally led. Patient had looked like a portfolio that had grown from 19 million to 35 million under my management, almost entirely through retention and organic expansion rather than new business acquisition. Patient had looked like the night I had spent in a hospital waiting room in Cincinnati while my mother was in surgery, drafting a quarterly review on my laptop because a client had pushed up his timeline, and there was no one else at the firm who knew the account well enough to write it cold. Patient had looked like 14 Christmases where I had taken at least one work call from a relative's living room. Patient had looked like a wife who had stopped asking when the raise was coming because she had learned, by the 3rd or 4th year, that the question hurt me more than the answer hurt her. That afternoon, sitting in his office, watching him perform the gentle confidence that had carried him through 6 versions of this conversation, something in me went still. Not angry, not yet, just still. The kind of stillness that arrives when a long argument inside your own head finally settles on the same side of itself. I didn't say anything for a long moment after he delivered the line. I let the silence sit between us the way you let a piece of evidence sit on a table during a deposition. He waited. He was good at waiting. He had been doing this job for 22 years, and one of the things he had learned, probably earlier than most, was that silence in a negotiation almost always works in favor of the person with the larger title. Eventually, people fill silence. Eventually, they soften their position just to make the discomfort end. I had done it before. I had done it in this same room, in this same chair, more times than I wanted to count. This time, I let him fill it. "I know it's not the answer you were hopping for," he said finally. The leather made it sound again. "But I want you to know we see what you're doing, we see it. That's why I'm asking you to trust the process here." The process. Another word that had stopped meaning anything specific. Process, structure, rhythm, timing. These were the load-bearing words of a building that had been quietly emptied over the years. You could still walk through it, but if you tapped on the walls, you would hear how hollow they had become. "I appreciate the conversation," I said. I stood up before he expected me to. He had to recalibrate his posture in real time, and I watched him do it. He stood up too, half a beat behind, and extended his hand across the desk. I shook it. His grip was the same grip it had been in every meeting we had ever had together. Firm, brief, designed to communicate authority without warmth. I walked out of his office and down the hallway. The carpet was the kind of industrial weave that had been chosen probably 15 years earlier because it would not show wear. It had succeeded. It looked exactly the same as it had on the day I had first walked across it as a new hire in my 20s. There was something almost cruel about that. The carpet had aged better than I had. I joined the firm at 29. I had come in as a junior portfolio analyst, recruited out of a regional advisory shop where I had been the youngest person on the strategy team. The man who recruited me had since retired. He had been the kind of leader who actually mentored, who took an interest in your career trajectory beyond the next billing cycle, who made you feel like your work was being witnessed by someone who understood it. When he left, the firm had hired his replacement from outside, and the replacement had hired the current CEO from outside the year after that. I had watched the culture get rewritten in real time, layer by layer, until the version of the firm I had originally joined existed only in the memory of 3 or 4 people who were still around, and those people, like me, had learned to stop talking about it. The work itself had stayed interesting. That had been the trap. The portfolio I had built was complex enough to keep my mind engaged. The clients were sophisticated enough to make the conversations meaningful, and the problems we solved together were the kind of problems that gave you something to think about on the drive home. I had told myself year after year that the work was the compensation, that the relationships were the reward, that the title would come when it came, and the salary would catch up to the responsibility when the timing was right. The timing was never right. I understood that now, walking down the hallway with the carpet quiet beneath my feet. The timing was the mechanism. The timing was the answer, and the answer was no. The portfolio I managed was worth $35 million in assets under advisement, generating roughly $4.2 million in annual revenue for the firm. I knew that number because I had built the spreadsheet that calculated it. The spreadsheet existed on a shared drive, but the formulas were mine, and the underlying assumptions had been calibrated through years of watching how our specific client base actually behaved versus how the industry assumed they would behave. There was a difference. The difference was where the value lived. The largest single account in that portfolio was a manufacturing family out of Central Ohio. The patriarch, a man named Edward Kessler, had built a precision components business from a single garage operation in the early 80s into a regional supplier that now serviced 3 different aerospace primes. He was 73 years old, semi-retired, and he had been my client for 11 years. His son, Theo, had taken over the day-to-day of the business and was, in the slow way these things happen, becoming the primary decision-maker on the family's wealth strategy. I had managed that transition carefully. I had spent the better part of 2 years building trust with Theo at the same time I maintained the relationship with his father, and the 2 relationships were different enough that they required different approaches in the same conversations. The Kessler account represented 11 million of the 35 million I oversaw, almost a third of the portfolio. The firm knew this. The firm had been told this in every quarterly review I had ever presented. The firm had also been told repeatedly that the relationship was not transferable in the conventional sense, that the trust that had been built with the Kesslers was specific to the work I had done and the way I had done it, and that any transition would need to be planned years in advance rather than executed in a quarter. I had said this in a leadership meeting once, about 3 years earlier. I had said it directly, looking at the CEO with the slide deck still up on the screen. He had nodded the way he always nodded. Then he had moved on to the next agenda item without comment. The next time the topic of succession planning had come up, 6 months later, the conversation had been entirely abstract. No mention of specific accounts, no mention of specific risks. Just the kind of language that lets a leadership team feel like it has addressed a question without actually addressing it. I drove home that evening with the radio off. I had developed that habit in the last year or so. I used to listen to talk radio on the drive home or sometimes a podcast about market commentary. Now I drove in silence. I hadn't decided to start doing it. It had just happened gradually, the way habits replace other habits without you noticing the substitution. The silence in the car had become something I needed. A kind of decompression chamber between the version of me that worked at the firm and the version of me that walked into the house where my wife and my daughter lived. My daughter was 16. She was in her junior year of high school, and the conversation in our house had begun to shift, almost imperceptibly, toward college. There were tour to plan, applications to begin drafting financial aid documents that would need to be assembled in the next 12 months. I thought about that as I drove. I thought about how the salary I had been asking for 6 years would have made certain conversations easier. Not lavish, not luxurious, just easier. The kind of margin that lets a family make decisions based on what's best rather than what's manageable. I had been absorbing that gap for years quietly the way I had absorbed everything else. The patience had a cost. Someone had been paying it. I just hadn't been the only one. My wife's name is Helen. She is a clinical psychologist with a private practice she has built carefully over the last 20 years. She works with adults primarily, many of them in high-pressure professions, and she has a particular gift for sitting with people who have been carrying things for a long time without numbing them. She has, over the years, sat with me in our kitchen more times than either of us could count, listening to the long version of whatever the conversation at work had been that week. She had never told me what to do. That was not how she worked. But she had developed a way of asking questions that made the shape of a situation visible in a way I couldn't see when I was inside it. I walked into the kitchen that evening and she looked up from the cutting board. She had a bell pepper in one hand and a knife in the other, and she paused mid-motion when she saw my face. "Be patient," I said. She set the knife down. She didn't ask me to clarify. She had heard the phrase enough times in the previous 6 years to know exactly what it meant and which conversation it had come out of. She just stood there for a moment, looking at me across the kitchen island. "How long are you going to be patient for, Marcus?" It was not a confrontational question. She asked it the way she might have asked a client in her office, with the kind of clinical curiosity that didn't carry judgment but didn't leave room for evasion either. I stood there in my work clothes with my laptop bag still on my shoulder, and I didn't have an answer. "I don't think I can do it again," I said finally. She nodded. She picked the knife back up and resumed cutting the pepper. She didn't look at me when she spoke next, which was deliberate. She had learned somewhere over the years that the hardest conversations sometimes go better when no one is looking at anyone directly. "You haven't been able to do it again for a long time," she said. "You've just been doing it anyway." I set my bag down on the floor. I pulled out one of the stools at the island and I sat down. The pepper she was cutting was red, and the cutting board was the wooden one we had bought together at a farmer's market the summer before our daughter was born. I noticed both of those things with a peculiar specificity, the way you notice details in a room when something is about to change and you don't yet know what it is. "What would happen," she said, still not looking at me, "if you just left?" I had thought about that question before. I had thought about it in the abstract, on long drives, in the shower, in the brief minutes between waking up and standing up in the morning. But I had never thought about it as a real thing, with a real timeline attached. I had always considered it the way you consider the existence of other countries. You know they are there, you can locate them on a map, but you do not seriously plan to move to one. "I don't know," I said. "That's the honest answer," she said. "I think it might be time to find out." She finished slicing the pepper. She slid the pieces off the cutting board into a pan that was already warm on the stove, and the kitchen filled immediately with the small, clean sound of vegetables hitting oil. The sound was domestic. It was the sound of a life that had been built carefully over decades. And in the middle of that sound, in the middle of that kitchen, I felt something shift in me that had been stuck for so long I had stopped trying to move it. I did not make any sudden moves in the days that followed. That was not how I had been built, and the decision Helen and I had begun to circle was not the kind of decision that responded well to suddenness. I went to work the next morning and the morning after that and the morning after that. I drove in. I answered emails. I sat in the weekly leadership meeting and I listened to the CEO talk about a new initiative he wanted to roll out across the advisory tier, and I noticed for the first time with full clarity that I had stopped contributing to those meetings months earlier. Not deliberately. I had just slowly disengaged from the part of myself that had once believed the conversations in that room would lead anywhere I cared about. What I did do, quietly over the following week, was open a folder on my personal laptop that I had not opened in almost 2 years. The folder contained a series of emails I had archived from various people who had reached out to me at industry events, on professional networks, through warm introductions made by mutual contacts. I had kept all of them. I had never responded to any of them substantively. At the time, I had told myself I was being loyal. Now, looking at the folder, I understood I had been doing something closer to hedging. Some part of me somewhere had known to keep the doors from closing entirely, even when I wasn't ready to walk through any of them. There was one email in particular I returned to. It was from a woman named Vivienne Ross, who ran the advisory practice at a smaller firm based in Chicago. She had reached out to me 18 months earlier after we had been seated next to each other at a dinner during a conference in Phoenix. The dinner had gone long. We had ended up in the hotel lobby afterward, both of us with one more drink than we had planned to have, and she had asked me a question that had stayed with me. She had asked me what kind of practice I would build if I were starting from scratch with full authority and a reasonable budget. I had given her an answer that surprised me as I was giving it. The answer had been more detailed and more confident than I had realized I was capable of, and she had listened the entire time without interrupting once. Her email, sent 2 days after the conference, had been short. It had thanked me for the conversation, said that her firm was thinking about building something in the direction I had described, and offered to continue the conversation when I had time. I had written back a polite acknowledgement that hadn't committed to anything. She had replied with grace, said the door was open, and left it at that. I wrote to her on a Thursday morning at 6:14 from my personal email, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier. I told her the situation in broad strokes. I told her I was not interested in a recruitment dance. I told her that if she was still building what she had described, and if her firm was prepared to compensate the work appropriately, I would like to talk seriously. She responded within 40 minutes. She suggested a call the following Tuesday. She said she would block 90 minutes and that she preferred to do these conversations in person if possible, but that Chicago was a flight away and we could start by phone. She said one more thing at the end of the email that I read 3 times. She said that she had been waiting to see if I would ever respond, and that the question she had asked me in Phoenix had not been casual. She had been interviewing me without telling me. The call happened the following Tuesday at 10 in the morning. I took it from my home office, with the door closed and my phone set to silent, because I had decided I did not want to have this conversation from the parking garage at work or from my car in some empty lot during a manufactured lunch break. The conversation deserved a real room. So did I. Vivienne started by walking me through what her firm had built in the 18 months since we had spoken in Phoenix. The shape of it had clarified considerably. They had brought on 2 senior advisors from a competitor, established a research function that operated independently from the sales function, and quietly built a client base that had grown by 40% in the last year alone. She told me the numbers without bragging. She told me the numbers the way you describe the dimensions of a house you are inviting someone to consider living in. Then she asked me a question that surprised me. Marcus, what would you need to be in a position where you wouldn't be having this conversation with anyone else for the next 10 years? I had been preparing for the standard questions. The why are you considering leaving question. The what are you looking for question. The where do you see yourself question. I had answers for all of those, rehearsed silently in the car over the previous several days. I did not have an answer for the question she actually asked. I sat in the silence for a moment. The morning light was coming through the window above my desk at an angle that made the dust visible in the air. I watched the particles move for a few seconds before I answered. I would need to be paid for the work I actually do, I said. Not for the title someone is willing to assign to it. I would need authority that matches the responsibility. I would need to know that when I bring a problem to the leadership team, the conversation is about solving the problem, not about managing the optics of it. And I would need to feel at the end of every year that the year had been a real year, not a holding pattern dressed up as progress. She did not respond immediately. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, the way you can hear someone thinking when the connection is good and the room behind them is quiet. I can do all of that, she said. We spent the next hour talking about specifics. The role she was describing was not quite a parallel move from my current position. It was something larger. A senior partner role with equity, with a defined book of business I would inherit and a mandate to build the next layer around it. The compensation she proposed, when she walked me through the structure piece by piece, was almost double what I had been making at the firm. The equity component, conservatively projected, would more than triple that number over a 5-year horizon if the firm continued at its current trajectory. I did not respond to the numbers in the moment. I had learned over 20 years in this industry not to react to numbers in real time. I told her I needed to think about it carefully. I told her I would respond by the end of the week. She told me she understood and that she would not be talking to anyone else about the role during that window. She said it the way someone says something they actually mean. I hung up the phone and sat at my desk for a long time afterward. The dust was still moving in the light. The house was quiet. My daughter was at school. Helen was with a client. I was alone in the room with the largest decision of my professional life, and for the first time in 6 years, I felt, instead of dread, something that was very close to relief. I accepted the offer on Friday afternoon. I called Vivienne from my home office at 3:12, gave her the answer she had been waiting for, and we agreed on a start date approximately 4 weeks out. She told me she would have the paperwork over by end of day Monday. I told her I would handle my resignation the following week, on my own timeline, without involving her side of the equation in any way. She said she had expected nothing less. The weekend passed slowly. I did not tell my daughter what was happening. We had agreed, Helen and I, that we would wait until the decision was fully executed before we brought her into the conversation. She had enough on her plate with junior year, and we did not want to introduce uncertainty into her week when the situation, from her perspective, would resolve itself before she ever had to weigh in on it. I did, however, spend more time with her that Saturday than I had in months. We watched a movie together that she chose. I made breakfast on Sunday morning that took longer than it needed to. I noticed myself paying attention to the small details of the weekend in a way I had not paid attention in years. The texture of a normal Saturday, when you have decided that the Mondays ahead of it will look different, becomes something you suddenly want to remember. I drove to the office on Monday at the usual time. I had decided I would not resign on a Monday morning. Mondays at the firm carried their own weight, with the operations meeting at 9 and the leadership stand-up at 10:30, and I did not want my resignation to land in the middle of either of those. I would do it on Tuesday. I would put a meeting on the CEO's calendar for the end of the day, and I would deliver the news cleanly, and then I would go home. The meeting request went out at 11:14 on Tuesday morning. I sent it directly to his executive assistant, with the subject line marked simply as confidential brief. She responded within 10 minutes with a confirmation for 5 o'clock. The CEO's calendar that day, she noted, had cleared earlier than usual, and he could see me at 5 if I preferred. I told her 5 was fine. I spent the rest of the day doing nothing remarkable. I answered emails. I had a 15-minute call with a junior analyst on my team who had questions about a position sizing model I had built 3 years earlier. I ate a sandwich at my desk. I wrote out, by hand on a yellow legal pad, the 3 things I wanted to say in the meeting and the order I wanted to say them in. I had learned a long time ago that important conversations go better when you have written the key sentences down beforehand. Not because you read from the page, but because the act of writing them sharpens what you actually mean. At 4:58, I walked down the hallway to his office. The light through the windows had shifted to that late afternoon angle that makes everything look slightly more serious than it is. His assistant smiled at me as I approached. She did not know what was about to happen. She was a kind woman who had worked for him for 9 years, and I had always liked her, and I was sorry in a small way that the conversation I was about to have would create work for her in the days ahead. I knocked on his door at exactly 5 o'clock. He waved me in without looking up from his monitor. I closed the door behind me. I sat down in the chair across from his desk for what I knew, even before I opened my mouth, would be the last time. He finished what he was doing on his monitor before he looked up. It took perhaps 90 seconds. I waited. I had done this before, the small ritual of being made to wait briefly at the start of a meeting that he had agreed to take, and I had always understood it as a small assertion of hierarchy. This time, sitting in the chair, I noticed I did not feel the usual quiet sting of it. I felt nothing about it at all. The gesture had lost its power because the relationship that gave it meaning was already on my side of the table over. When he looked up, he gave me his standard opening smile. "Marcus, what can I do for you?" "I'm resigning," I said. "My last day will be 3 weeks from Friday. I'll handle the transition of my accounts professionally, and I'll do whatever the team needs me to do during that window to make the handoff clean." He held the smile for half a second longer than the news warranted. Then it dropped. He leaned back in his chair, and the leather made the sound I had come to know the way you know the creak of a stair in your own house. "Marcus," he said. "Wait, slow down. What's happening here?" "I've accepted another role," I said. "The decision is made. I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to give you proper notice and to make sure the transition goes well for the firm and for my clients." He looked at me for a long moment. I watched him cycle through what I now recognize were the standard responses he had prepared, somewhere in the back of his mind. For a moment he had probably been told by HR or by his own coach was inevitable but had never quite believed would actually arrive. Surprise first, then concern. Then a careful pivot toward what he assumed would be the real conversation. "Is this about the review last month?" "It's about 6 review cycles," I said. "But yes, in some sense, that was the one that confirmed what I already knew." "Marcus." He leaned forward. He put both palms flat on the desk. "I think we may have been further along on your compensation than I communicated. There are conversations happening at the board level right now about how we recognize leadership across the advisory tier. If you can give me 30 days, I think I can come back to you with a number that changes this conversation. I had been waiting for that sentence. Not the specific sentence, but the category of sentence. The one that arrives when an organization realizes, too late, that the patience it has been requesting has just expired. The sentence is always reasonable on its surface. It always offers something that 6 months earlier would have meant something. But it is delivered in the wrong meeting at the wrong moment, and what it actually reveals is that the resources had been available all along. They had simply been allocated deliberately somewhere else. I appreciate the offer, I said, but the decision is final. I'm not in a position where a counter would change anything, and I don't want to waste your time or mine pretending otherwise. He looked at me for a long time. The clock on the wall behind him read 5:15. I see, he said finally. The careful confidence had gone out of his voice. He was already, I could tell, beginning to think about what he would say to the rest of the leadership team in the morning, about how he would frame this, about what version of the story would protect him most. I stood up. I thanked him for 19 years. I shook his hand. I walked out of his office at 5:17, and I did not look back at the doorway because I no longer needed to. I told my team the next morning. I gathered the 6 people who reported to me directly in the small conference room on the 11th floor, and I told them clearly and without sentiment that I was leaving, and that I would be available to them for the next 3 weeks to make the transition as clean as possible. There were questions. Most of them were not the questions people asked out loud. I answered the ones that were spoken, and I did not editorialize on the ones that were not. The official announcement went out from the CEO's office the following afternoon. It was 3 paragraphs long. It thanked me for 19 years of service in language that had clearly been workshopped by someone in communications. It mentioned my contributions in the kind of general terms that did not name a single specific client or initiative. It announced in the 3rd paragraph that my responsibilities would be redistributed across 2 existing leaders in the meantime while the firm conducted a search for a permanent replacement. I read the email at my desk. I closed it. I went back to the documentation I had been working on for the transition. 3 days later, on a Friday morning at 10:42, my personal phone rang. The number was Theo Kessler's. I answered it. He was direct. He had heard the news through the kind of informal channel that operates between sophisticated clients and the people who actually work on their accounts. He wanted to know if it was true, and if it was, what my situation looked like. I told him the situation in the broad strokes that the non-solicit allowed me to share. I told him I was bound by certain restrictions for the next 12 months. I told him that whatever decisions he made about the family's relationship with the firm would need to be his decisions, made entirely on his side of the table without any guidance or suggestion from me. He was quiet for a moment. Marcus, he said, I want to be honest with you. We've been with that firm because of you. My father said it directly to me about 2 years ago. We are not, in his words, a firm client. We are a Marcus client. He told me that the day he handed me primary responsibility for the relationship. I did not respond to that. There was nothing I could say to it that would not put me in the wrong place legally and ethically. I'm going to make some calls today, Theo said. I'm not going to ask you anything else. I just wanted you to know what we are likely to do. We ended the call. I sat at my desk and did not move for a long time afterward. The Kesslers terminated their advisory agreement with the firm on the following Monday morning. $11 million in assets, approximately $1.4 million in annual revenue, walked out of the building in a single email sent by their family office attorney to the CEO. The email was, I later learned, 2 sentences long. It cited a clause in the original agreement that allowed for termination with 30 days' notice. It did not give a reason. It did not need to. The phone calls started that afternoon. The first one was from the CEO directly. He left a voicemail. His voice on the recording was a voice I had never heard from him before, controlled but with something else underneath it that I recognized only after the second listen as panic. He asked if I could call him back at my earliest convenience. He said the words "at your earliest convenience" the way someone says them when they have been trained, over a long career, never to sound like they are asking for help, even when they very obviously are. I did not call him back. The emails started that evening. The first one was from the CEO, marked high importance, the subject line phrased in a way that was meant to feel collegial but read, in context, as something closer to a plea. He wrote that he wanted to talk through some questions that had come up internally, that he hoped we could find a constructive path forward, that there were things he had been thinking about over the past several days that he wished he had said sooner. He did not specifically mention the Kessler account. He did not need to. The timing of the email said everything that the language of the email had been carefully constructed to avoid saying. I read it once. I closed it. I did not reply. 2 more emails arrived over the following week. The second was from the firm's chief operating officer, whom I had worked alongside for 11 years, and who, in that time, had never once sent me an email after 7 in the evening. This one arrived at 9:23 on a Tuesday night. It asked if I would be open to a brief conversation, off the record, about transition questions that had come up in the wake of recent developments. The third email was from the CEO again, shorter this time, the tone more direct. He said he believed there were aspects of my departure that had not been handled the way they should have been, and that he would like the opportunity to address them. I did not reply to either of them. There was nothing for me to reply to. The conversation they wanted to have was a conversation that had been available to them for 6 years, and they had chosen, consistently, not to have it. The fact that they wanted to have it now, in the specific week following the loss of an $11 million account, was not a coincidence I felt any obligation to validate. 2 more clients walked over the following month. I learned about both of them the way I learned about everything from that period, through quiet sources in the industry who had no reason to lie to me and no interest in dramatizing what they were seeing. The firm did not collapse. Firms rarely do. But the version of it that had assumed I would always absorb whatever it required me to absorb, that version did not survive the quarter. The CEO was still in his chair a year later. The board, however, had brought in a new operating partner to oversee the advisory tier, and the structure he had built his authority around had been quietly reorganized underneath him. These things never happen quickly. They happen the way erosion happens, in small, visible stages, until one day the shape of the coastline is no longer the shape it used to be. I started at the new firm 4 weeks after I left the old one. The work has been what Vivienne told me it would be. The compensation has been what she said it would be. None of that, in the end, is the part of the story I want to leave you with. The part I want to leave you with is smaller. It is this. I had spent 6 years being told to be patient, and the patience had cost me more than I had realized I was paying. The thing that finally set me free was not their cruelty. It was their assumption. They assumed I would keep absorbing it because I always had. The assumption was the thing that finally let me see what I had been to them all along. If you have been carrying something at work that you have stopped being able to name, leave a comment and tell me what part of this landed. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe because there are more of these stories coming. Thank you for staying with me to the end of this one.